Hi. So this video is going to look a little bit at democratic governance. Specifically, I want to spend a few minutes talking about models of power, a little bit about democracy and what makes a society democratic. Um, and then I want to talk a little bit about what I see as the sort of central tension that exists between democracy and freedom, which, as you know, are two core social values in American society. So let's start with power, and we're going to define power here as the ability to attain goals over the objections of others. So power is essentially your ability to get or achieve something in spite of other people trying to prevent you from being able to accomplish that. There are two broad models of power. One is what we call the elite model of power. The other is what we call the pluralist model of power. So an elitist model of power is one that assumes power is concentrated in the hands of a few rather than broadly dispersed, whereas a pluralistic model of power is one in which power is sort of diffusely distributed among various groups and interests. First model is sort of very top-down, power is very concentrated, and everybody else in society struggles in part because they don't have the ability to advance their agendas. A pluralist model envisions a more conflict-driven model in which various groups have differing types, perhaps, or differing levels of power, but nevertheless are able to deploy power in certain circumstances in certain ways as they try to advance their agenda. So, we'll talk about those models of power and how they work in the context of American politics a little bit later. As I said, I also want to talk a little bit about what we mean when we say that American society is democratic. And there's a lot of debate. There isn't really a clear consensus about what makes the United States a democracy. Some people argue that having a process in place in which people can exercise their democratic preference or democratically exercise their preference for certain outcomes is enough to make a society democratic. In other words, we have elections. Those elections inevitably produce outcomes or results. People have access to that process. Therefore, the outcomes of that process, whatever they look like, are democratic because they were achieved through the application of a democratic process. For other people, the outcome of the process becomes the critical consideration, right? You can have elections, in other words, that produce outcomes, but if the structures in the electoral system operate in such a way that only a certain number of people or a certain kind of set of preferences are either represented in the options or certain outcomes are achieved irrespective of the intentions of the vast majority of people, then it really isn't particularly democratic. And I think that you can kind of see this illustrated in the 2014 gubernatorial election here in Illinois. I think you can see it in most elections, but I think 2014 is particularly relevant because we're in the state of Illinois, and it was a very interesting sort of opportunity to see the way in which these processes work out and how we get outcomes from processes that don't necessarily reflect the will of most of the people. So in 2014, and for those, you guys might be a little bit young, in 2014, the two candidates, the two major party candidates for governor in the state of Illinois were the incumbent, a guy named Pat Quinn, who's the Democrat, and the challenger, Bruce Rauner, who is a Republican. The state population in 2014 was about 12.8 million people. Actually, 12,882,135. I'm cheating. I've got the numbers kind of jotted down over here. I didn't have that memorized. I I hope you didn't think I did. But that was the population back in 2014. So, of the population of a state, not all the people are eligible to vote in an election. You have to be an adult. You have to be a resident of the state. You have to be a citizen of the United States. You can't have a felony conviction, et cetera, et cetera. So when we take the pool or the population of eligible voters, it's always going to be smaller than the population of overall. This is no different. So the population of eligible voters in 2014 was 9,739,920, which is about 75.5% of 100%, right? So about 75% of the population of the state of Illinois is eligible to vote. But just because one is eligible to vote doesn't mean that you are allowed to vote. If you are allowed to vote, it's because you've registered. You're eligible, but you have then also registered to vote. So if we look at the population of registered voters in 2014, it was 7,282,639. So that is a subset of a population. Right? So all the people in the state, eligible voters in the state, registered voters of that pool of eligible voters. So we're down to about 56%, a little over 56% of the whole population of the state are registered to vote. So we get a population, but only about half of the people are registered to be able to express a preference for leadership at the state level. Then you've got voter turnout. This is actually the population of people who actually show up. And in 2014, voter turnout in the general election in November of that year was 3,508,302, which is a little over 27% of the total population. Well, a little less than half of the total number of registered voters. And of course, the total number of registered voters is about 75% of the eligible voters. So a subset of a subset of a subset of a population. Maybe you see where I'm going with this. In that election, about half of the people who turned out to vote voted for Pat Quinn. Slightly more than that voted for Bruce Rauner. So we ended up with Bruce Rauner as our governor. Bruce Rauner was the stated preference of about 14% of the total population of the state of Illinois. So 14% of the population of the total state gets to decide who our governor is, right? All of us have to live under that leadership, but only 14% of the state expressed that preference at the polls. Now, obviously, you can make an argument, well, if people really care, they should show up, or more people should register to vote if they're eligible, or we should find ways to expand the eligible pool of voters. And that is all legitimate and good, and you're seeing part of the problem, right? If we want a truly democratic outcome, we want to make sure that we get as much participation as possible in that process. But even if that's true, even if we get 100% of the eligible voters to show up and vote, and there are ways that you could conceivably do that, there are still ways in which the outcome may not be particularly democratic, and that has to do with what we mean when we talk about democracy. Now, democracy as a form of government is a form of government in which citizens participate in government. Its characteristics include things like competition for office, public officials who are responsive to public opinion, and of course the citizens having access to accurate and reliable information so that they can make electoral choices. As a value, right, democracy is the idea that collective decision making is going to reflect, I should say, the participation of equal citizens, right? That we're going to have a collective decision that is genuinely collectively made. So as a cultural value, democracy is obviously a lot broader than just the idea of a democracy as a kind of form of government. But you can see the way in which they're connected. So democracy, not surprisingly, has a lot of variety in terms of its form, but I do think that it's possible to sort of distill some essential or some core concepts. One, you can think of democracy as the capacity to participate in the effective control over collective choices that affect our lives as members of society. I'll say that again because that was a big mouthful, right? You can think of democracy as the capacity to participate in the effective control over collective choices that affect our lives as members of society. In other words, if some particular process or if some particular set of conditions has an impact on us, a democratic principle would hold that you should have some say in how that process or how those conditions operate. Right? That's the idea of democracy beyond just a particular form of government. It's the idea that things that impact us entitle us to a say in how those things unfold. So it can take a lot of forms if you want to look at it in terms of governance or in terms of collective decision making. If we want to take it maybe a little bit more broadly, you can have what we call direct democracy. Direct democracy is a form of democracy in which issues are decided directly by the citizens. We just put everything up to a vote. You could also have what's called representative democracy. Representative democracy is democracy in which decision-making is concentrated at the top by representatives who are elected by the citizenry. So we take our time to vote for people who will then go off and represent our interests in local government, municipal government, state government, federal government. Now, there are also some hybrid versions of this in which particular issues are decided through referenda, right? So some issues get put on a ballot, and the citizens vote directly on an initiative. They may not vote on the specific wording or the language of a law or policy, but they essentially stake out a position on a topic or an issue and say, here's what we want our representatives to do in the city council, in Springfield, in Washington, D.C. So referenda are a kind of direct democracy, but most of the time when we vote, we're likely going to be voting for representatives who will go to the city council, they'll go to county government, they'll go to the state government in Springfield, or they'll go to the federal government in Washington, D.C., and they will do those things sort of on our behalf. This is still, I think, somewhat limited. We're still thinking about this mostly in terms of, people who are going to represent us or issues that we're going to vote on, and that leans pretty heavily on that kind of representative model or governance model of democracy, rather than thinking about it broadly as a cultural value or a social value. So we'll talk about that. We'll talk about the limitations of democracy as conceived specifically as kind of participation in government as opposed to participation in collective decision making. And those are two very different things, or at the very least they can be. It is also important to point out, before we move on to talk about freedom and the tension between freedom and democracy, democratic governance, especially if it's structured in a representative fashion, but it's also true in direct democracy as well, can very often be strongly influenced by what we call veto groups. Now, veto groups are just interest groups who essentially have ownership over particular issues. Now, ownership is a kind of an amorphous concept. People don't own issues in a literal sense. Rather, ownership is a kind of broad social and cultural consensus that some groups are sort of the go-to voices on particular issues. So, for example, in the United States, the National Rifle Association, I would argue, is the group that has ownership over gun control issues. And the way you know that they have ownership is that every time an issue related to gun control legislation or efforts to sort of expand or enforce gun laws more aggressively, the National Rifle Association is sought out for comment by politicians and by people in media, right? Because it is widely agreed upon that that should be the group that gets a say in all of this, because they are they are, after all, sort of the voice in the United States on the issue of gun control, in part because that position has been conceded to them by the media, by government, and by a sizable portion of the population. All right, so the same thing. If you want to think about it in an entirely different way, if there's a local school board, right? So you have a local K through 12 school district, has a local school board that's made up of members of the community. The overwhelming composition of that school board is going to be people who have kids in the district, right? The idea that somebody who doesn't have any kids in the local schools would be on the local school board, it's not unheard of, but generally speaking, right, the voice that people listen to when it comes to representing the interests of children in the local schools is going to be the parents of those children. So that's what we mean by a veto group, just a group that is broadly and consensually sort of seen by a majority as having some degree of say over an issue. All right. So I want to talk about democracy and how it interacts with freedom. So to do that, of course, I need to remind everybody what we mean by freedom again. And as a cultural and social value, going all the way back to the very beginning of the semester, remember that freedom is the capacity to make choices over one's life. The idea that you should be free as much as possible to live your life without interference from others. And that's a very strongly held value in American society, as is democracy, right? So these are both, very, very important fundamental or core social values. 205, and I think that most Americans would probably agree with that assertion, at least to some degree or another, that freedom and democracy, both very, very important social values. All right, so what is the problem with democracy? Well, I think there are lots of problems with democracy. For the record, when I say there are problems with democracy, I'm not saying it's a bad form of governance or it's a bad sort of value. I actually have a tremendous amount of affection and admiration for democracy. I think it's a great thing. But there are problems related to democracy, and this is a class and social problem. So we want to talk about the way in which democracy is problematized or problematic in American society. The central problem of democracy, I think, is that the issues that surround democratic governance are embedded in a broader value conflict between individual autonomy and power. And the nature of that conflict is this: people should be free to make choices that affect their own lives as separate persons, right? What we call freedom. People should be free to make choices that affect their own lives as separate persons. And at the exact same time, people should have the capacity to participate in collective decisions that affect their lives as members of a broader community. Democracy. So we should be free to live our lives as much as possible without people interfering in our lives. But the fact that our lives are going to have impact on the lives of other people entitle those other people to a say in how we live our lives. That is the central tension of freedom and democracy, right? That as you increase freedom, you increase the instances in which people exercising that freedom are going to have impact on the lives of people who do not have a say in how you are exercising your freedom. If, on the other hand, we increase democracy, what happens is individual freedom is going to end up getting curtailed. Right? Again, it's not necessarily a bad thing trying to find a balance between these two very, very valuable and important social values. But people who pretend like democracy and freedom are completely compatible miss out on how these things operate as values, as things that give rise to social norms. Remember, all social norms, all the things that we do that are normal, have at their core an underlying value that legitimizes and informs that behavior. That's the relationship between values and norms. The things that we value, the things that are important to us, are manifested in behaviors that we engage in. So values and norms are always linked. And so people very often just focus on the norms without thinking about the underlying values. And when the underlying values are, kind of exist in tension with other underlying values, people often miss that because that's not the level at which they're looking at this. So as I see it, there are kind of four broad issues or questions of concern here that kind of entwine themselves with this tension, that kind of shape what it looks like and how it plays out, and how we might set about trying to resolve that tension if we can. The first issue, the first question of concern is, can we distinguish between decisions that affect only individuals and those that affect a broader community? That's a very legitimate question, right? How do we differentiate the things that I choose to do that affect only me versus the things that I choose to do that affect other people? Can we meaningfully and reliably separate those things? The second issue of concern is, are issues of collective concern sort of within the scope of collective decision making? Right, so if I have a factory in central Illinois and I decide that I'm going to close that factory and retire, or I'm going to move that factory and all of its production to some place where labor costs are less expensive, say East or South Asia, that decision that I make is going to have a huge and mostly adverse impact on the economy and the health and the well-being of this small town. But I still get to make that decision because private property, right, and the exercise of private property is only minimally impacted by collective decision making. The people in the town can't take a vote and prevent me from moving my factory. So in this instance, the decision making is actually not within the issue of concern here is that it's not actually within the scope of collective decision making, right? Private property insulates a lot of decisions from democratic oversight. In this case, freedom is kind of winning out over democracy in a significant way because the exercise of freedom is kind of operating in a way that is not subjected to democratic oversight, even though it's abundantly clear that that decision will have an adverse impact on the people in that town. The third question of concern is this. Do processes of collective decision-making grant equal access to everybody rather than just a right to participate, right? So when we have an issue that's genuinely within the scope of collective decision-making, does everybody have equal access to participate in that process, or just a right to participate? You didn't register to vote, you don't get a say, even though, again, it's a process of collective decision-making. You're part of the collective. The fact that you didn't register, is it really meaningful to use that to bar somebody from being able to contribute to that collective decision? And then finally, the fourth issue is, can we avoid plutocracy? Right? Can we avoid a system in which people with tremendous amounts of money and other resources are able to distort or game the system in a way that works to their benefit? And I think that's the core proposition regarding democracy in America, right? A lot of decisions that are of really significant importance to society as a whole and that have really, really deep ramifications for the public are basically being made as private decisions by capitalist firms. In other words, and to kind of cut to the chase, private property ends up distorting or undermining democracy in many respects, and in a significant and maybe disturbing number of instances. So we're going to talk a little bit about that. I was actually going to fold all of this into one video, but I think, at almost 50 minutes now, it's probably a good idea to cut this one short and just make a very short video as a follow-up to talk a little bit about systemic imperatives, because I want to talk about those things, but I also know that I've been talking now for almost 50 minutes. So I'll just leave it there, and I'll say see you next time. Take care.